First of all, thank you for joining us today. Now, some of my colleagues and I, a couple years ago, organized a special issue on black boxes, and this research is related to that. My primary interest in black box technologies relates to my major research project. I want to understand how biologists interpret evidence. That study left me with more questions than answers in the end. And when my research turned from the history of evolution in natural selection to the history of evolution in sexual selection, that question about black boxes followed with me. Now, that brings me to the point of my presentation. I want to offer another case study for black boxing in the history of evolution. Specifically, I argue that the British sexologist Henry Havelock Ellis crafted a black box for Darwinian sexual selection, much like earlier evolutionists crafted a black box for natural selection. Now, it's a sticky case, especially since the senses play such a defined role in sexual selection, both for Ellis and his Darwinian contemporaries. I mean, mating displays necessarily rely on sight. Olfactory signaling requires the ability to smell. You may be asking how it is possible to craft a black box from sensory perceptions, given that black boxes are about the lack of sensory perceptions in observation. Now, I argue that Ellis created a black box around the concept of sexual attraction and arousal, bringing the otherwise morphological processes of mate selection into the realm of invisible physiological responses. And many of you will recognize Havelock Ellis from his expertise in human sexuality and attraction. He is most known among historians as the person who introduced sexual inversion, or same-sex attraction studies to the English-speaking world. He wrote the first English language textbook on the subject, Sexual Inversion, and became an influential scholar through the efforts of global networks, such as the British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology. While most historians do not actively think of Havelock Ellis and instantly associate it with the word evolutionist or Darwinist, I nonetheless want to argue that Ellis defended Darwinian theory at a moment when concepts like natural selection and sexual selection were under increased scrutiny, and not in the least criticized by the co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace. So let's go back to Ellis. He actually encountered Darwin's theories while very young, like many British children of his era. While Ellis's early education almost certainly did not contain pro-evolutionary texts, Ellis later read widely on the subjects of biology and literature, eventually becoming quite fascinated by aesthetics in both areas. A physician friend of the family suggested that he enroll in medical school as a way to pursue his interest in biology, not unlike other evolutionists in the 19th century. He performed well enough, but Ellis was already juggling his literary aspirations and his medical responsibilities as he was going through medical school. After a failed attempt as a literary editor, Ellis proposed a scientific series to Walter Scott Publishers called the Contemporary Science Series. They approved it, and it was through this series that Ellis became engrossed in the evolution debates, not just a spectator to say. The first book in the series was The Evolution of Sex in 1889 by Patrick Geddes, a former student of T.H. Huxley, and J. Arthur Thomson, a specialist in marine corals. The book focused on sexual dimorphism, the morphological traits that distinguish one sex from another, and their relation to sexual selection. Most importantly, the authors jumped directly into the Darwin and Wallace debates over sexual characteristics. They called for an investigation into the physiological basis for sexual dimorphism and, consequently, explored the morphological differences between male and female organisms. Now, Ellis took up that charge that they gave to naturalists and he spent a great deal of scholarly effort on studying the physiology of sexual dimorphism. However, at this point, it's around his 30th birthday in 1890, Ellis begins to publish his first two books. However, I'm going to skip them and start with his third book, Man and Woman, which he wrote in 1894. This book was a close study of sexual dimorphism through the lens of sex selection. He really goes into the differences between men and women, biologically speaking, and also in terms of psychobehavioral differences as well. In the book, first, Ellis attempted to refine the categories used by morphologists to describe male and female characteristics. He used this discussion to explore the degree to which the division between the sexes was natural and how much was the product of social tradition or just plain bias. Ellis pointed out the need for better categories of these sexual characteristics before the question of sexual division, and therefore sexual selection, could be satisfactorily studied. Ellis suggested that secondary sexual traits should be those which triggered sexual arousal, thereby aiding sexual selection. So that was Ellis's contribution to something that Darwin basically acknowledged. This definition was important to Ellis, and not just because it related to his lifelong interest in aesthetics and biology. Ellis was acutely aware that attraction alone was not enough to ensure reproductive success. First, according to Ellis's notes and self-reflections, he encountered sexual difficulties for most of his life. While he found women beautiful, he was not able to consummate the physical sexual act. In that way, Ellis's own sexual embodiment changed the way he thought about Darwinian selection. For him, secondary sexual characteristics displayed by either sex were, of course, a necessary part of reproduction, but they were not sufficient. He knew this from personal experience. There was an invisible physiological response to that sensory input, which he called tumescence, that connected the mating display to the actual sexual act itself. In a subsequent book, Sexual Selection Man, written in 1905, Ellis asserted that all sexual sensations were channeled through this physiological response. And just a quote from there, "The chief stimuli, which influence tumescence, and thus direct sexual choice, come chiefly, and indeed exclusively, through the four senses of touch, smell, hearing, and sight. All the phenomena of sexual selection, so far as they are based externally, act through these four senses." And here we get this external-internal dichotomy that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. Ellis's sexual selection research both preceded and succeeded his famous textbook on same-sex behaviors, that book Sexual Inversion that I mentioned earlier. This Darwinian research program offers essential context for Ellis's conception of same-sex attraction. It was in 1892, in the midst of this research on secondary sexual characteristics, that he was contacted by the classicist John Addington Symonds about a collaboration. Symonds wanted to know if Ellis would be interested in writing a book about same-sex behaviors in humans. Same-sex attraction interested Ellis both for personal and political reasons. He cared for several people who happened to be sexual inverts, not least of whom was his wife, Edith Lees, who had both expressed sexual attraction for other women and acted upon those desires with his blessing. Now, it's within this book, Sexual Inversion, that I find the most fascinating of these black boxes that Ellis actually creates, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about them. Ellis understood that even sexual excitation was not enough, or the only factor affecting sexual selection. I mean, his own wife, Edith, directed her sexual energies not towards men, but towards members of the same sex, and Symonds himself had male partners. But what caused some people like that to respond to the secondary sexual characteristics of the same sex? Ellis created a black box around human sexuality itself, where its inputs were aesthetic sensations and the outputs were attempts at reproduction. And it's within this black box that Ellis becomes the most Darwinian. Like Darwin, Ellis, in his attempt to conceptualize the system of human attraction, began with domestic pigeons. He notes that the inversion of sexual instinct has been observed in carrier pigeons, and that some pigeons carry secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex, such as coxcomb or vocal crowing in females. He then proceeded to link same-sex attraction among various indigenous cultures around the world before approaching sexual inversion found in European civilizations. By doing so, Ellis is tapping into a 19th century narrative used by naturalists, including Darwin, to create a link between the qualities held by animals and then working up to those held by humans and then perceived by more advanced or civilized humans. He was asserting that sexual attraction was a variable like other Darwinian qualities, such as physical abilities or fitness or even morality. Sexual attraction, in relation to secondary sex characteristics, was therefore a matter of degree, not a difference of kind. After a literature review of research into same-sex attraction, Ellis offered his own medical and scientific case studies in the book Sexual Inversion. From this observation, Ellis concludes that sexual inversion was largely a congenital phenomenon. Ultimately, he likened same-sex attraction to other Darwinian variations. And I'll just go into a quote to give you an idea of what that looks like. He says, "Thus, in sexual inversion, we have what may fairly be called a sport, or variation. One of those organic aberrations which we see throughout living nature, in plants and animals." And within the context of late Victorian society, that conclusion had pretty substantial political implications. But perhaps the tying together of physiology and Ellis's social commentary is best captured by one of Ellis's closing lines. And I quote, "Pathology is but physiology working under new conditions." As I said, this is something of a sticky case study in which Ellis actually creates a black box around human sexuality, the responses that people feel towards external Darwinian stimuli for the secondary sex characteristics, and he's conceptualizing what that attraction actually is, how it works. Still, I'm perplexed by the qualities of this black box. I'm wondering how a black box so dependent on sensations as an input affects how I think about black boxes in general, especially those technoscientific black boxes I had mentioned earlier. From the case study, I've really begun to question how I think about opaqueness in black boxes. What does it mean to not be able to see something? And are these black box spaces always theoretical in nature or conceptual in nature? And I say this because we're stretching the concept of black box a little, in that the actual process of sexual mating displays, attraction, and then the mating response are visible. They're open to observation. And yet, Ellis still is able to create that box around it. So it makes me wonder, what is the actual opaqueness of that black box? And how might that comment about those technological black boxes, the uncertainties that come with them, and how we define, as historians looking back, the operations and limitations of black boxes in theorization? So, with that, again, I have many more questions than answers, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that follows this, especially those of my other colleagues on the panel and the chair. Again, thank you for everybody who's helped to put this on, and I will defer to those questions.